Hey everyone, my name is Ivy and I'm going to be talking about politics on YouTube.
Yay!
When I first got into anti-SJW content, it was around 2015 or 2016, so when I graduated from high school and was about to go into college. When I got into it around the time, I think it was when anti-SJW content was at its peak. The type of content that I ended up watching when I first got into it were these feminist slash SJW compilations. They were just being recommended to me all the time, regardless of the kind of content that I watched. So I just ended up watching it just out of curiosity. These videos, they were basically like, oh, look at these crazy looking people with these crazy sounding viewpoints. Looking back on it, it was very low quality content. Definitely, because I mean, they're just compiling a bunch of clips. Of course, I am definitely guilty of watching that low quality content at the time because it was just one of those types of videos that I would watch whenever I'm bored. I just want to, turn my brain off. I would end up being recommended all these reactionary videos from content creators who would respond to different videos that went viral at the time. I remembered when Humongous was a big thing and I got introduced to a bunch of content creators from that. Cultural appropriation was a big controversy. There's even infamous YouTubers that people kept criticizing nonstop. People like Milo Stewart and Riley J. Dennis, they were often the targets of these people making these type of videos because a lot of viewpoints that they had were crazy and like outlandish at the time. Or at least they were viewed as such because when it comes to making reactionary type videos, you're going to end up throwing some people under the bus, and unfortunately they were some of those people. I also ended up watching a lot of Gamergate videos. I'm not really sure if Gamergate started around the same time that I personally got into this whole skeptic community, or if it started way before that, but there were still a bunch of videos made around Gamergate, and of course there was, a lot of people who were also thrown under the bus when it came to making videos criticizing like the ethics of gaming journalism. So like Anita Sarkeesian and Brianna Wu and a bunch of other people too, but those were the main perpetrators that were, targeted. And thanks to these type of videos, I ended up being recommended a lot of content creators that I ended up watching obsessively. I've been watching videos from content creators such as Shoe on Head, Roaming Millennial, Some Black Eye, Blair White, Chris Raygun, Amazing Atheist. I watched some of these content creators not because of the good production value and also their really fun and like enjoyable personalities, but also because as an Asian woman, I could identify with some of them more because of the fact that they're either women, a person of color, or both. Of course, that's not to say that I didn't watch content from straight cisgendered white guys, because of course it's going to be primarily populated by them. It is made by white guys for white guys. For the most part, I do tend to watch content from YouTubers who I can personally identify with in regards to either race, sex, or sexuality, or just like other marginalized identities or whatever. But I do find their content rather interesting, as well as their position rather unique in the community at large, just because they are a member of a marginalized group or multiple marginalized groups, but they do not share opinions with the left, nor are they willing to go and support the left just because their opinions in regards to certain viewpoints do not align with the left. And thanks to how rigid the left can be in regards to like, oh, you have to share this viewpoint or else you're like a fascist or something. It also felt nice to know that even though they are part of a victimized or a vulnerable group, that they aren't willing to adopt the victim mentality or have this woe is me mentality in regards to like dealing with issues regarding who they are as people. And it was honestly really empowering to watch that, because it's like, well, as much as it's nice to point out that yes, there are inequalities and issues running through our society in regards to social issues, it's also nice to know that, oh, you shouldn't expect other people to like just feel bad for you, have like this sort of like defeatist mentality. It was really nice to watch people who, even though they have a lot of things stacked up against them, that they're not willing to put themselves down just because it honestly does feel hopeless at times. But what's crazy was that like, even though I watched this type of content almost 24/7, in all honesty, like I was obsessed with this type of content, is the fact that I myself am considered an SJW according to these content creators. When I got enrolled into college, I joined a bunch of clubs and organizations that revolved around a sense of identity, like race, sex, and gender. I went to a bunch of rallies that fought against bigotry and brought to light certain events that happened around that time. I even dedicated my time to attending conferences and conventions that were focused on developing a much more positive sense of self and wanting to be a better ally for those that you don't necessarily share an identity with. It was thanks to those conventions that I was able to learn how to become a better, more intersectional ally and know how to help others who I don't necessarily share an identity with or experience the same life experiences that they have. I surrounded myself with people who honestly would be made fun of by these YouTubers, and I didn't mind because they were fully accepting of who I was as a person. I was basically one of those people that gave way too many fucks about intersectional activism and making sure that modern day society is more accepting and inclusive of everybody, especially those whose identities are the polar opposite of those that are a lot more acceptable and even socially desirable. In other words, I should have been the last person to have dove into the anti-SJW rabbit hole as hard as I did, but I did anyways. The first reason is that the skeptic community just seems more rebellious because of how accepting they are of those who have life experiences and opinions that deviate from what is considered politically correct. Now, there are plenty of opinions that I did understand where they were going with what they're saying, but I still just don't agree with it. I mean, I don't think that supporting representation is bad or that multiculturalism is dangerous, but I also still did have opinions that are rather taboo to talk about, and I was too afraid to express them out of fear of coming off as bigoted. One of the biggest opinions I had were regarding race. The hometown that I grew up in was very small and very white, so I ended up dealing with a lot of racialized bullying because I was one of the only people of color in my class, and I was definitely the only person of color that was very visibly not white. So I dealt with a lot of bullying in regards to my skin tone, like my overall appearance. A lot of students, they either assumed that I was Mexican or Chinese, and neither of those assumptions were ever in good faith either. So of course I dealt with a lot of racialized bullying as both an Asian person, but also a Mexican person. Unfortunately, this type of bullying didn't dissipate when I was moving from small town to small town. Of course, I felt very isolated because of that. I felt like I couldn't truly hang out with a lot of people, and it really did stunt my social growth because not only was I moving from town to town constantly, but I was just having the worst luck with a lot of my classmates. They just couldn't understand that, yes, I'm different, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm a dangerous person, but they thought so anyways. Or at least, it's not bad to be different, but then again, these are the types of people that would make fun of other white people for having features that look similar to mine. That's how terrible it is. What made things a bit different, however, was that around middle school, we moved into a Black majority neighborhood. And so, of course, the school that I went to was a Black majority school. I felt like things were going to be different around that time because while a lot of racialized bullying that I suffered through were from white people, not only out of sheer ignorance, but also out of fear. And I felt like, since I'm surrounded by a racial minority group, I would be much more, accepted because they would at least identify with and sympathize with what I've went through. And that just wasn't the case. I ended up dealing with a lot of racism and xenophobia. They told me to go back to China or go back to Mexico or whichever country they deemed undesirable. They've made fun of how I looked. They called me racial slurs. It's gotten to a point where, if I knew that they were serving rice for lunch, I would wait inside the bathroom and check the lunch lines to make sure that the line completely died down. And so that way, then I would be able to grab my food because I've dealt with a lot of bullying during lunchtime. I've dealt with so much bullying in that Black majority school, and it genuinely broke me. I felt like nobody would be able to understand me because it felt like no matter what I did in society, I'm not a white person, but I'm also not a Black person. And so it felt like I was just shrugged aside, The worst part about all the racialized bullying that I dealt with was that I felt like in the end it was sort of my fault. Whether it's dealing with racist actions from white people or black people, I felt like even if I did try to voice my issues to like the teachers or to like a counselor or something, they still wouldn't really understand. I didn't know anybody else that dealt with these issues, and so I felt like it was just an individual thing. I felt like, oh, well, bullying's normal. I gotta deal with it. Regardless of whether the racist actions were from white people or black people, they both really struck deep because it felt like the anti-Asian racism that I dealt with, oh, it's just shrugged off. It's like normalized, or like, oh, it's just shrugged off as a joke. And that's why it was so difficult for me to basically go to the teachers or to the counselors about this type of stuff, because it can just be plausibly shrugged off. And even when I did deal with like the very severe type of racialized bullying, you know, like being made fun of for my appearance or being told to go back to whichever undesirable country they deemed me to be from, it felt like nobody would really understand, and so they're not gonna help. And like that really hurt, because when it came from black people specifically, I felt scared to talk about these issues. They've always had this, oh, is it because I'm black type mentality, you know what I mean? Like I didn't want to come off as anti-black for calling them out for being racist. As a result of everything I went through, I grew resentful, and I still am annoyed of how the racial dynamics in the United States is always talked about through a figurative and a literal black and white dichotomy. It leaves out a lot of people of color communities. It refuses to acknowledge that there's a lot more nuance in regards to racism, and how there's more to racism than just the extremely overt like KKK type racism, you know? What's worse is the perception that I and many other people have Asian privilege because of the model minority label, and therefore racism against Asians isn't as bad as other forms of racism. I felt solace in hearing viewpoints about black people that polite society would never entertain the notion of, like how Black Lives Matter is rather toxic, or how black people can also be racist. It was also considered a sigh of relief to know that my opinions don't make me a bad person, because many people on YouTube, whether it's through their videos or in the comments section, would understand the issues and also express that they have experiences that are similar to my own. The second reason is that I want to fight for social justice too, but I also don't want to go too far with it. I watched videos that criticized and made fun of the trigger-happy nature of SJWs as a way to learn how to present myself without going too insane. It's weird to say it because in hindsight the content is rather vapid and shallow, but I wanted to convince others why social justice is important without turning them away. It's not bad to have this type of goal in mind either. After all, it's best to utilize the protege effect in a way that didn't deter anyone who's either on the fence or on the other side. What I ended up learning, whether directly or indirectly, is that I shouldn't get too emotional about certain topics. I shouldn't force my opinion down other people's throats. I shouldn't be against different opinions just because they're offensive. And that I should develop a thick skin around microaggressions and edgy jokes. These are honestly pretty obvious morals, but they're the types that I've picked up from a vast majority of videos. But it's thanks to this mentality of wanting to be more accepting of other people that I ended up being more accepting of alternate viewpoints that I wouldn't have bothered listening to otherwise. Not all viewpoints are considered bigoted or prejudiced, and it's often best to try to distinguish the difference. That was the main issue though. I couldn't. Reason number 3 is that I had that not like other girls mentality. I wanted to avoid being considered a feminazi by opening up to viewpoints that feminists would never entertain, or at least the type of feminists that anti-SJWs and skeptics alike tend to be very critical of. You know, the type of feminists that care only about women's rights and never about men's rights. Looking back on it, it was that sort of caricaturizing of what all feminists seem to be that a lot of people, including women, refuse to call themselves feminists. As much as I did seek out female YouTubers, I ended up also being gravitated towards a lot of male YouTubers because of how open they are in regards to men's issues. Of course, a big reason as to why is because, well, there's a lot of men in the anti-SJW community in general. it honestly feels like a sausage fest. There's so many guys. They would bring to light men's suicide rates and body image and false rape accusations and child custody battles, just a myriad of other issues that affect men, like how, the homicide rates tend to be overtly populated by male victims, or how when it comes to college, there's a lot more women than there are men because there is more of a societal push to help women through college, but unfortunately men do not have that same support to go through their educational endeavors. Another thing that contributed to my not like other girls mentality was my struggle with internalized misogyny. I know this term sounds really stupid, but in regards to how society does prop up men in comparison to women, and how men and women have vastly different expectations. A lot of us women, we do tend to internalize these expectations in regards to how a lot of things that men do, it's fine in comparison to women. Something as simple as franchises that are catered towards women tend to be a lot more openly mocked than franchises that are marketed towards guys. Another thing that contributed to this toxic, not like other girls mentality was my struggle with internalized misogyny. I know this term sounds like crazy SJW lingo, but when you really think about it, it kind of makes sense. There are a bunch of societal expectations placed on both men and women, but what's unique is that when it comes to these expectations, there is a lot of expectations for women to be feminine, but also a lot of pushback against women that are either not feminine enough, but also too feminine. Femininity is always the one that is constantly being criticized. Aspects of pop culture catered towards women tend to be criticized a lot more than aspects of pop culture catered towards men. What sucks even more is that there really is this fine line of how to express yourself as a feminine being, and for the most part, in order to gain social capital or to seem more acceptable to a male-dominant society or a society that values masculinity over femininity, you have to basically demonize other women for being too feminine. Unfortunately, I ended up embodying that sort of stereotype as well. I was one of those idiots that were like, oh, look at me, I wear loose clothing. I don't care about my appearance. I'm not super feminine like those women. Please pick me, it's so stupid. And it was very toxic. During that time, even though I cared so much about social issues, I went about it in a way that seemed like I'm better than these women who are doing it as well because, oh, look at them, they're embracing these rigid binary expressions of gender, when in reality, no matter how masculine or feminine your gender expression is, alongside this sort of spectrum of masculine and feminine, neither of them are wrong. There's no wrong way to express yourself as a woman. Sadly, it took me so long for me to acknowledge that and to realize that this type of mentality that I had is rather toxic. I shouldn't have to throw other women under the bus in order to make myself be perceived as more attractive or more acceptable to really shitty guys. At the height of my personal and political journey within the skeptic community, I watched only exclusively that type of content. It validated a lot of issues that I had with society that was really fun to watch. I watched every upload that each and every one of my favorite YouTubers made and even rewatched some of the videos as well. The issue with this, however, was the fact that I based myself being a good person over the perception that the other side is far worse than me. It didn't help that a lot of videos, if not every video, implied that every social advocate and feminist are these caricatured boogeymen that are out to ruin society. I couldn't have nuanced conversations about social issues. Instead, I was thrown into echo chambers and circle jerks. I was basically one of those edgy losers that based their entire personality off of being an anti-SJW. The reasons that I brought up earlier as to why I was interested ended up being the very reason why I became obsessed. As much as I wanted to believe that nothing I did wasn't harmful, it ended up backfiring on me. What I went through was a textbook example of the foot in the door phenomenon. Of course, I wouldn't accept scientific racism or that social activism is detrimental to society or that men are superior to women. But I can listen to opinions about race relations and feminism and gender constructs that I wouldn't have ever entertained the notion of if it wasn't for my obsession with wanting to use the protege effect to try to get people out of the alt-right. As my exposure became more potent, I ended up going from harmless reactionary videos to videos talking about the Jewish question, race realism, mental illness regarding the LGBTQ+, so on and so forth. The most terrifying part was that I didn't notice when the transition happened, and the reason why I didn't notice was because I was so used to hearing all these different opinions that I just assumed it was the same as every other opinion I've heard. They deserve the right to have it, and they're not bad for having it. The funny thing is, I don't remember what specific video got me mesmerized into the community, but I do remember the exact video that snapped me out of it. Roaming millennials, people of color, you are not oppressed. First off, the video didn't really talk about people of color, as in every racial group that's not white European. It was just about black people not being oppressed. This touched a nerve because it honestly felt like clickbait. Like, if you're going to talk about black people not being oppressed, just label the video Black people, you are not being oppressed. Stop using the term people of color to refer to black people, because people of color is a much more broader umbrella term for pretty much everybody that's not white European. And if you're gonna talk about black people, just say black people. It's not that tough. I was really surprised by how annoyed I was with the video, considering how there were so many other YouTubers that also did very annoying things, like how Thunderfoot would make a bajillion videos about Anita Sarkeesian. And I know, I agree with a lot of sentiments about Gamergate. I definitely did not understand the more nuances regards to it. And of course, I jumped on the blind hate train in regards to Anita Sarkeesian being this sort of spawn of the devil or whatever. But really, you had to make videos about her 24/7? What? My annoyance with the video only got exacerbated when I saw a response video by a YouTuber named Sean. Just Sean. Thanks to that response video, I was really thinking about what the hell I was doing online. I googled a lot of the content creators that I used to watch, and I was very shocked by how closely linked they were with a lot of white supremacists, whether it's them being friends with them, or them supporting them, or even just being part of the alt-right or the alt-light. Speaking of white supremacists, by the time I got to my senses, I was watching videos from James Alsop and Rage After Storm. It's genuinely pathetic that I didn't know or realize that nothing I did was helping my plans, but was actually helping theirs. Their pursuit of having the growing influence garner viewers and even new believers that would promote their ideology that would never be compatible with a diverse multicultural society. I also ended up comparing both the videos. I felt like it was wrong that a half Asian woman would use the model minority label as something to be proud of and even weaponize it against the black community, whereas a cishet white guy acknowledged the data that she used and explained why there's an economic disparity between Asians and other racial groups. I felt a combination of happiness and frustration during and after watching his video. I was happy because for once, a non-Asian person has realized that there's more to Asians that make us considered a good minority other than us having a better culture or having better work ethic or something. It also irritated me because I felt like people were able to accept his video because he is a straight cisgendered white guy. If I, an Asian woman, made a response deconstructing not only Lauren Chen's video, but also the model minority myth as a whole, I'd get a whole lot more backlash than he would, because I'd be viewed as this non-white female SJW that's out to ruin society. In conclusion, I fully recognize that I did and still do have non-politically correct and even toxic viewpoints that made me susceptible to being a member of the skeptic community. I'm still trying to find ways of how to cope with the trauma I've suffered and to cope with the fears that I have of the unknown without letting it get in the way of people just wanting to live their lives and without it risking people's livelihoods. It's pretty scary for me to admit that as much as I try to make the world a better place, my existence will always amount to me being a total waste of space, and I'm honestly terrified of how people are going to react to my admittance of my faults. I'm still trying to find out which of my actions matter more, the things that I've done in real life or the things I've done online. After all, the internet nowadays is so closely linked to the real world that the Venn diagram just looks like a circle. Either way, thank you for taking time out of your day to watch my video.